Hello guys, welcome to the video of a step-by-step installation on the hard drive. That is the installation of Kali Linux. So in this section, we assume that you have a bootable USB drive or a DVD. For the details on how to prepare such driver, you can see it in the previous videos, and that you booted from it to start the installation process. So you can follow it simultaneously. Open this video in your mobile phone, and you can insert your USB pen drive to your system and follow the instructions which I give. Okay, so now first we will take a look at standard Kali installation with an unencrypted file system. So let's start up with the booting and starting the installer. So when the BIOS or UEFI has been booting from the USB drive or a DVD-ROM, the ISO Linux bootloader menu appears as shown in the figure. At this stage, the Linux kernel is not yet loaded. This menu allows you to choose the kernel to boot and enter optional parameters to be transferred to it in the process. Okay. So by using the arrow keys, you can go up and down. You can navigate through it. Either choose graphic installation or install, or then you can press enter key to initiate the remainder of this installation process. Each menu entry hides a specific boot command line, which can configure as needed by pressing the tab key before validating the entry and booting. Okay. So once booted, the installation program guides you step by step to the process. We will take a look at each step in detail, and we will cover installation from standard Kali Linux live image. Installation from mini.iso may look slightly different. We will also address graphical mode installation, but the only difference from the classic text installation is the appearance. The versions pose identical questions and present identical options. So one more thing, as I said, we have a live forensic mode here. Okay, so this was the thing which I needed to tell it to you. So now let's move on to the selection of the language. So here, as shown in the figure, the installation program begins in English, but the step allows you to choose the language that will be used for the rest of the installation process. This language choice is used to define more relevant default choices in subsequent stages. But what we recommend is you go through the language as English itself, so that it will be easy for installation. Even if you are familiar, if you know these languages, go with the English one, so that if you get any error, you can search it and solve it quickly. Next is the selection, selection of the country. So in this step, it consists of choosing your country combined with the language. This information enables the installation program to offer the most appropriate keyboard layout. Okay, this will also influence the configuration of the time zone. In the United States, for example, which we have selected here, a standard QWERTY keyboard is suggested, and the installer present a choice of appropriate time zone. Okay, so this is the configuration of the keyboard. Next, what we have is selecting the keyboard layout. The proposed American English keyboard corresponds to the usual QWERTY layout as it is shown in this figure. And next we have the option for detecting hardware. In the vast majority of cases, the hardware detection step is completely automatic. So the installer detects your hardware and tries to identify the boot device used in order to access its content. It loads the module corresponding to the various hardware components detected and then mounts including on the boot device. A file of limited size and loaded into memory by the bootloader when booting from the boot device. Next what we have is the loading component. With the content of the boot device now available, the installer loads all the files necessary to continue with its work. This includes additional drivers for the remaining hardware, as well as all the components of installation program. So next what we have is detecting network hardware. In this step, the installer will try to automatically identify the network card and load the corresponding modules. If automatic detection fails, you can manually select the model or module to load. If all else fails, you can load a specific module from a removable device. This last solution is usually only needed if the appropriate driver is not included in the standard Linux kernel, but available elsewhere, such as the manufacturer's website. This step also must absolutely be successful for network installation, since the Debian package must be loaded from the network. Next, what we have is the configuration of the network. In order to automate the process as much as possible, the installer attempts an automatic network configuration using Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol or DHCP for IPv4 or IPv6 and IPv6 Neighbor Discovery Protocol as shown in the figure. So if the automatic configuration fails, the installer offers more choices. Try again with a normal DHCP configuration. Attempt DHCP configuration by declaring the name of the machine or set up a static network configuration. This last option requires an IP address, a subnet mask, an IP address for a potential gateway, a machine name, and a domain name. Now the installer prompts like this one. So the installer prompts to create a new user. Since it automatically creates a user account in the sudo group, this means that the user has full administrative privileges through the sudo command. This is helpful due to the fact that multiple items are available through administrative privileges. The installer also asks for the username for the account as well as password. The installer will request confirmation of the password to prevent any input errors. Next, what we have is configuring the clock. So if the network is available, the system's internal clock will be updated from the Network Time Protocol NTP server. This is beneficial because it ensures timestamps on log will be correct from the first boot. If your country spans multiple time zones, you will be asked to select the time zone that you want to use, as shown here. Next, what we have is detecting disks and other devices. So this step automatically detects the hardware or hard drives on which Kali may be installed, each of which will be presented in the next step, partitioning. So, partitioning is an indispensable step in installation. It consists of dividing the available space on the hard drive into discrete sections or partitions according to the intended function of the computer and those partitions. Partitioning also involves choosing the file system to be used. All of these decisions will have an influence on performance, data security, and server administration. The partitioning step is traditionally difficult for new user. However, the Linux file system and partitions include virtual memory or a swap partition and must be defined as they form the foundation of the system. This task can become complicated if you have already installed another operating system on the machine and you want to two to coexist, that is the dual boot. In this case, you must make sure not to alter its partition or if need be resize them without causing damage. To accommodate more common partition scheme, most users will prefer the guide mode that recommends partition configuration and provides suggestion each step of the way. More advanced users will appreciate the manual mode, which allows for more advanced configuration. Each mode shares certain capabilities. And the next screen allows you to choose the disk where the Kali will be installed by selecting the corresponding entry. Okay, as you can see it here. Once selected, guided partitioning will continue. This option will erase all the data on the disk, so choose wisely. Next, the guided partitioning tool offers three partitioning methods which correspond to different usage, which is as shown in the figure. The first method is called all files in one partition. The entire Linux system tree is stored in a single file system corresponding to the root directory. This simple and robust partitioning scheme works perfectly well for personal or single user system. Despite the name, two partitions will actually be created. The first will house the complete system and the second the virtual memory or swap. The second method, separate home partition, is similar but splits the file hierarchy into two. One partition contains Linux and the second contains home directory, meaning user data and files and subdirectory available under home. And one benefit to this method is that it is easy to preserve the user's data if you have to reinstall the system. The last partitioning method is called separate or home, var, and temp partitions and is appropriate for servers and multi-user system. It divides the file tree into many partitions. In addition to the root and the user account home, partition is also partitioned for server software data like var and temporary files like temp. One benefit of this method is that the end user cannot lock up the server by consuming all available hard drive space. At the same time, service data can no longer clog up the rest of the system. After choosing the type of the partition, the installer presents a summary of your selection on the screen as partition map. You can modify each partition individually by selecting a partition. Yeah, this was the image. And next, what we have is the manual partitioning. Okay, wait a second. Yeah. So next what we have is manual partitioning. Selecting a manual at the main partition disk screen permits greater flexibility, allowing you to choose more advanced configuration and specifically dictate the purpose and size of each partition. For example, this mode allows you to install Kali alongside other operating system, enable a software-based redundant array of independent disk RAID to protect the data from hard disk failures and safety resize existing partition without losing data among other things. If you are less experienced user working on a system with existing data, please be very careful with this setup method, as it is very easy to make mistakes that could lead to data loss. The first screen is a manual installer is actually the same as one shown here, except that it does not include any new partition to create. It is up to you to add those. First you will see an option to enter guided partitioning followed by several configuration options. Next, the installer will show the available disk, the partition, and any possible free space that has not been partitioned. You can select each displayed element and press Enter key to interact with it as usual. If the disk is entirely new, you might have to create a partition label, and you can do this by selecting the disk. Once done, you should see free space available within the disk. To make sure of this free space, you should select it, and the installer will offer you two ways of creating partition in that space. The first entry will create a single partition with the characteristics of your choice, and the second entry will use all free space and will create multiple partitions in it with the help of the guided partitioning wizard. Yeah. So when you select create a new partition, you will enter into meat of the manual partitioning sequence. After selecting this option, you will be prompted for a partitioning size if the disk uses a MS-DOS partition table. You will be given the option to create a primary or logical partition. Then you should see the generic pattern or partition configuration screen like this. Okay? So to summarize this step of manual partitioning, let's take a look at what you can do with the new partition. So you can format it and include it in a file tree by choosing a mount point. The mount point is the directory that will house the contents of the file system on a selected partition. The second thing is you can use it as a swap partition. When the Linux kernel lacks sufficient free memory, it will store it active parts of RAM in a special swap partition on the hard disk. The virtual memory subsystem makes this transparent to applications. And the third thing is make it into a physical volume for encryption to protect the confidentiality of the data in certain partitions. Fourth one is make it a physical volume for LVM, and note that this feature is used by the guided partition when you set up encrypted partition. use it as a RAID device, and choose not to use the partition and leave it unchanged. When finished, you can either back out of manual partitioning by selecting Undo Changes to Partition, or write your changes to the disk by setting Finish Partition and write changes to the disk from the manual installer screen. Next, here we see the copying the live image. So this step, which doesn't require any user interaction, copies the content of the live image to the target file system as shown in the figure. Next, what we have is configuration or configuring the packet manager or APT. If you want to use a local mirror instead of HTTP Kali org, you can pass its name on the kernel command line at the boot time with the syntax like mirror/http/hostname is equal to my.own.mirror. This installer program proposes to use a HTTP proxy as shown in the figure. An HTTP proxy is a server that forwards HTTP requests from network users. It sometimes helps to speed up download by keeping a copy of the file that have been transferred through it. In some cases, it is the only mean of accessing an external web server. In such case, the installer will only be able to download the Debian packages if you properly fill in this field during installation. If you do not provide a proxy address, the installer will attempt to connect directly to the internet. Next, what we have is installing meta packages. So if you are installing the system from either the installer or net installer image, you will now be given the option to pick which package would you like to install. Keep in mind that this will require internet access. So if you are using the net installer image, you are given the choice of desktop environment and which tool selection you would like to be included. You can also change these selections at any time after Kali Linux has been installed, even if you use the live image to install Kali. Next step what we have here is installing the grub bootloader. The bootloader is the first program that started by the BIOS. This program loads the Linux kernel into the memory and then executes it. The bootloader often offers to a menu that allows you to choose kernel to load or the operating system to boot. Due to its technical superiority, grub is a default bootloader installed by Kali. It works with the most file system and therefore doesn't require any update after each installation of a new kernel. Since it reads its configuration during boot and finds the exact position of the new kernel, you should install grub to the master boot record MBR unless you already have another Linux system installed that knows how to boot Kali Linux. So in this step, you must select which device grub will be installed on. This should be your current boot drive. Okay, this one. And by default, the boot menu proposed by the grub shows all the installed Linux kernel as well as any other operating system that were detected. So this is why you should accept the offer to install in the master boot record. Keeping older kernel version preserves the ability to boot the system if the most recently installed kernel is defective or poor adapted to the hardware. We thus recommend that you keep a few older kernel versions installed. And the next step what we have is finishing the installation and rebooting. Now that the system or the installation is complete, the program asks you to unplug your USB drive or remove the DVD-ROM from the reader so that your computer can boot into the new Kali system. After the installer restarts the system, finally, the installer will do some cleanup work like removing packages that are specific to creating the live environment. It will also detect if Kali Linux has been installed in the virtual machine and automatically install any guest tool to help integrate between the host and the Kali guest. So this is the installation on fully encrypted file system, which I will cover it in the next video.